Again, the conditions were rough, and life for a lot of these workers was short. It led to calls for reform. Your book asks the question, did industrialization bring about an improved standard of living? Well, obviously it did at first. But in the short run, it might have led to more poverty, or poverty was deeper for most of the factory workers than it would have been had they remained on the farms. They were not making enough pay to, you might say, make ends meet in the budget. And a lot of factory owners would build the houses they expected the workers to live in. And that way the factory owner would pay the worker a wage and then turn right around and collect it back because the worker was expected to shop at the company store and to pay his rent to the company owners. My daughter has done 3 sessions at Disney World, and they've worked her way through college, working at Disney. And Disney is one of the few places where they allow the company to own the housing you live in. The factory-owned housing was outlawed by President Roosevelt in the 1930s. But a lot of times the factory owner would try to collect all the money back that you had earned. And there was a popular song, you might have heard it sung about 16 tons, about a coal miner, 16 tons, and what do you get? Another day older and deeper in debt. But the last line of the song was, I owe my soul to the company store. Any of you heard the song? One or two of you. It was really popular when I was younger. It's obsolete now. But anyway, it's telling how that the wages were low, conditions were hard, and you were always in debt, hopelessly in debt, with virtually no chance to get out. Which led to the rise of a doctrine or philosophy called socialism. Socialism promised that if we control all the wealth in the country, everybody will be paid equally. There'll be no more poverty, and there'll be no more persons forced to work long hours. And they believed that they could create a heaven here on earth, but they had to have control. That was the key. They had to have control. So basically they said all the factories should turn in all the wealth to the state. All the farmers should turn in all the produce to the state. And then the state would redistribute this wealth to each and everybody, according as each and every person had need, to where no one would have to do without. Now, this was the beginning of the idea of socialism. The idea first came about like around the 1830s, which means it's been around for about 180 years. The idea really became popular in the 1880s. And socialism has led to ideologies such as Nazism, fascism, communism. All right, it's questionable whether you can find an instance where socialism has actually worked. When my dad was a young man and my mother was a young woman, Europeans and Americans fought hard against National Socialism and fascism in Italy. And as soon as the war was over, Europe and Canada turned right around and embraced socialism headlong. I'm jumping ahead of the story a little bit. The United States keeps on embracing it. Again, does it work? Anybody have any comments? Yes, go ahead.
I agree with you.
It's a bad system.
And
Yeah.
we suffered a lot there in the Middle East, and in Russia and North West. If you see people, if you see the economy,
Anybody
because
else?
it's
Yeah.
against people instincts.
Well, one thing socialism did in both Russia and China, it starved millions of people to death, not because they didn't produce the food, it was because it was not distributed. Yeah.
So it's basically the person that's in control is probably the corruption. If he's
Yeah.
Okay, now I want to tell you, I'm glad you brought that up. Most of the time, the person in control is corrupt. But there was an instance in Latin America where 2 monks controlled everything, and these monks lived, not even in their own house, they lived in the church. And they lived below the people. They saved none of the money themselves. They lived in squalor, lived in poverty, but they collected all the wealth and redistributed it. And no way that you could accuse them of any kind of corruption. And it still didn't work. I mean, most of the time it leads to corruption, that's true. But it encourages a lack of production. Hey, I'm going to be fed whether I work or not anyway. Yeah. So, my work. Yeah.
It's against the human being nature. We, as a human being, we love to own.
We love to own, and we want to strive. If we're normal, we want to strive to get ahead.
Yeah, it's unfair
To work hard to get ahead. It's basically against the human nature. What did I say? The American Indians, I may have mentioned, their problem was they were basically socialist. I'm talking the Indians that lived here in North America, and their cultural level was, I have to rate it at 0. But the Indians would feed each other, the ones who worked alongside the ones who didn't. The non-productive received the same amount as the hardworking, and the result was they didn't share their wealth. They all shared their poverty. And folk, I have to say this, the United States is rushing pell-mell headlong into the cauldron of socialism. And I don't like the truth. All right, anybody going to comment? We should know better, yes.
I think that somehow, I don't think America's going to get all the way into this socialism. But it's hard to try to mingle the two is where I think our problem is. We're trying to say, we know we have a responsibility to those that are lagging behind, but you can't take our society and the way it's set up, which is not true capitalism, but whatever we want to call it, and try to marry the two. That's where our big problem is coming, trying to
have the best of both.
Yeah,
the best of both. We're going to have a hybrid society where it's half socialist and half capitalist to encourage the capitalist, and yet we're still going to take a big chunk of the wealth from the capitalist and give it to the some people. I understand you can't. You have some people who are needy, and of course you always have your orphans. It's just a fact of life. Some people will lag behind. Yes.
I worked at CVS in the pharmacy, and a lot of the times, like, people will be driving really nice cars, and they come over, and I work at the drive-thru, and they have Medicaid, they have WellCare, and they have, like, really nice cars, like $60,000, $100,000 cars, and they're coming over here, and I'm like, I don't understand it. They pay 50 cents for their medication, or it's free.
Yeah.
I mean, insurance is ridiculous.
When I was in junior high school, our teacher told us, don't ever give money to a beggar, because if you follow him home, you'll find out he's living in a nicer house than you are. And a lot of food stamps are being used to buy laptop computers, and maybe not, but I've heard that, color televisions and things like that, not necessarily to buy food. And,
Food stamps with
you can't buy a TV with a food stamp, maybe not, but I've heard it that they often used to buy
Yeah, you get
the money. Well, to some extent, the money you save on food with food stamps can be used to buy this other stuff. There are such a thing as genuinely poor. All right, I may have told you this. I'll tell you now. I don't hesitate to tell it. I grew up in poverty. I understand. But I've also been told by some people I have a hardened attitude against poverty because of the fact I grew up in it. The reason I was in poverty was because my father made some bad judgment decisions, and he's deceased. I hate to talk about it, but a lot of it was due to his own bad judgments, his own fault. And therefore, I want to say, well, if you're in poverty, it's your own bad judgment, your own fault. Not necessarily, not always, but in a lot of cases it is. Now, every one of you in the sound of my voice will find yourself in a situation in your lifetime, if you haven't already, where that your pay is this much, your obligations are here. Have I found myself there? Well, many a time over. just got to try to cut back on this, increase on this, cut back on it until it balances. It will eventually balance. Hang in there. You'll eventually make ends meet. Poverty is has been described as a transitional period for a normal person, where you go through it for a while, but eventually you come out. There's a light at the end of the tunnel. Things get better if you don't do something foolish, like get your paycheck, look at your obligations. Oh my, I can't believe you got to go and booze it up, on your way home and drink it all down and go home broke, like a lot of men did during the Depression. I mean, hey, I understand that their obligations were bigger than their income. Still, that's not the way to handle it. There are ways to handle it. All right. Anybody else? Anyway, socialism, and we're going to be talking more about socialism and socialists from now on till the end of the semester, because after all, socialism is a big part of the philosophy of our world, particularly the Western world and even the Eastern world. Now after the first initial Industrial Revolution, there was a second Industrial Revolution that occurred in the late 1800s. The first Industrial Revolution began in the early 1700s, but the second one occurred in the late 1800s. And one of the big things that influenced it was steel. Now, for those of you who, hopefully you'll listen to my lecture. Yes?
I was just wondering, are you going to ask us for the dates?
The dates I'm giving right now are very generality dates. Yeah, not specifics. In other words, you can't put a date and say the Industrial Revolution began at 5 o'clock in the morning on November 3rd in a year. It's more of a gradual trend. Yeah, so it began, the second Industrial Revolution began approximately in the late 1800s, and it began at different times at different places, but there was no sharp dividing line. So, no, not really. But the first Industrial Revolution ran around textiles, as you'll notice if you look at the lecture notes or download the notes. It ran around textiles. The second one, a lot of it had to do with steel, well, steel and electricity. Now, steel was invented by the Chinese. Again, one of the many inventions that they made that should have propelled them to the top of the world, and somehow didn't. But steel is mostly iron, but it's back in almost every way it's better than iron. It's stronger than iron, it's lighter than iron, it's less prone to rust than iron is, and more malleable. You can make it where it can be made into springs. In other words, it can have a give to it, spring back into shape. All told, better to work with than iron. It's a mixture of iron and other elements, one of them magnesium. Again, what you mix it with will depend on what you want to use it for. And how much of iron and how much of magnesium you want to mix, again, depends on what you choose to use it for. Steel enabled the building of structural steel, which led to the building of bridges that formerly could not be crossed. In other words, you cannot make a bridge across the Mississippi River out of wood, but you can make one across the Mississippi out of steel. It also enabled taller buildings to be constructed, skyscrapers, using concrete. There's a limit to how tall you can get using steel. There might be a limit, but it's much higher. You can take a steel and glass building and go up 1,000 feet with it or more. And it has been done.